Good to be with you.
So let's start with the headlines coming out of the NATO summit, so far, at least from what we've seen. There was an issue about whether the various members would contribute up to 2%. Many are not contributing 2%. President Trump apparently went in and said, okay, I have a solution. I want you to contribute 4%, which is actually more than even the United States does. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, the 2% effort is to be met by 2024. So, in fact, there are several years before all countries must meet the responsibility. No NATO country is in arrears as we speak today. And 8 of the NATO countries are actually meeting that target this year, several years before 2024. So the reality is that NATO's actually been spending more since Russia invaded Crimea. But what's alarming is that the president seems to give the back of the hand to our closest allies and seems to embrace our most significant adversaries, particularly in Putin. And that's what's alarming as he has his participation in this NATO summit.
Well, as you suggest, Senator, he began the day in a meeting with Jens Stoltenberg, the Director General of NATO, really challenging Angela Merkel of Germany, saying, you're too dependent upon Russia. Is he right about that, that in fact, not just Germany, but much of Western Europe is too dependent for natural gas, their energy support, from Russia?
Listen, Germany, as well as our NATO allies, are our strongest allies in the sanctions against Russia for in Crimea, invading eastern Ukraine, for its undermining global democracy through its cyber attacks. So there are strongest sanctions. Would we like to see Europe as a whole be further diversified in its energy supplies? Yes. Should we participate in making that happen? Yes. But the reality is our strongest allies as it relates to sanctioning Russia is Germany and the NATO countries that have joined us in the EU. So it's amazing to me that, the one thing Putin has wanted to do is to break up the West, particularly the NATO allies. And it seems that the president, through his comments, are actually helping him. So I guess Putin made a good investment in 2016 when he got engaged in our national elections.
And right now, the relationship between the U.S. and Europe seems pretty fragile, not only because of the trade tensions rising, but also because the U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal, which you've been very vocal in opposing. How concerned are you that the U.S. might do irreparable harm to ties with its allies in Europe?
Well, look, I agree that the Iran deal was a bad deal, but there's a way to try to pursue the concerns of Iran having nuclear weapons in a different way, in which we will need our allies to multilateralize sanctions against Iran. But the trade sanctions that the president has invoked on tariffs, which are counterproductive, particularly to our closest allies, that are going to pinch middle-class families and potentially lose jobs here in the United States. And the conflict that he consistently has in berating our NATO allies, who are our strongest allies in the world. NATO's Article 5, which is a mutual defense agreement, has only been invoked once in its 73-year history. And that was on behalf of the United States after September 11th. And for 17 years, NATO's allies have been with us in Afghanistan. Their sons and daughters have fought and died alongside our sons and daughters. We should be respecting and applauding that, not berating them.
Right. And, Senator, we are also hearing that the U.S. is expected to impose tariffs on China by August 30th. China, of course, retaliating or vowing to retaliate against that. Where do you stand there? And do you think that the U.S. president's attitude towards China or towards trade with China is reckless, as some have pointed out?
Well, look, it's clear that China has unfair trade barriers as it relates to U.S. companies and to integrating into their markets. They have appropriated theft of intellectual property rights. There's a whole host of issues. But the way to achieve that was in a multilateral effort where Canada and the European Union and others were going to join us in the international forums to challenge China on these unfair trade practices. The tariffs themselves is not going to be the ultimate solution, especially when China has the capacity, because of its market, to counterattack with tariffs that are going to affect American farmers, American businesses, and ultimately American workers. And so there has to be a much more productive way in which we could achieve that. But when you take our allies like Canada and you say that they are a national security threat because of their steel or aluminum, and when you take other critical allies today and you say that they're a national security threat, and you use that very, very infrequently used provision of the law to suggest that our closest allies are a national security threat to us, you undermine our ability to have a collective front towards China.
Senator, President Trump has said that one of the most important responsibilities he has is nominating a Supreme Court justice. He's nominated somebody, and therefore perhaps one of your most important responsibilities is the confirmation process. How long do you think it will take, and what is your attitude toward the review of Judge Kavanaugh?
Well, look, we want the same vetting process that our Republican colleagues asked for previous nominees. They're going to want to have all of the documents, the speeches, the memos, all of the positions that he's taken, which are an insight, a window into anyone who will have a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. I think that's an appropriate vetting. I don't think that this actual nomination should be moving forward in 119 days towards an election cycle. That's Senator McConnell's own views as he held up the previous nomination of Senator Obama for a Supreme Court nominee. And then lastly, I have serious questions that Judge Kavanaugh, based upon his previous decisions and statements, including that the President of the United States can decide what is constitutional and not in terms of obeying the law, is someone who is going to be anything but an activist judge, and particularly on health care for all Americans, for women's reproductive rights. So we need an in-depth vetting of his views and everything he has ever written and said.